Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Blake Rocap. Welcome to the third event in our semester-long colloquium on reproductive justice, criminal law, and the carceral state. The colloquium is part of the Rapport Center for Human Rights Sissy Farenthold Reproductive Justice Defense Project, which I lead with Cristina Ramirez, who is at jury duty right now, if you can believe it or not, which is like the wild... Can't believe they're like, putting a public defender on the veneer for jury duty, but we'll see. Before I go further, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island and acknowledge the American Indian and indigenous communities who have been or become part of the lands we call Texas, including the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Coelectacan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and the Isleta del Sur Pueblo. The colloquium is part of an interdisciplinary seminar that Christine and I co-teach with Professor Karen Engel here at the law school. The students have read and written about Professor Heffernan's paper, the one that she'll present today, and they'll have a chance to ask some questions first before we open it up to the rest of the audience for other questions. With that, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Amanda Heffernan. She's Assistant Professor of Nursing at Seattle University and Clinical Placement Coordinator of the Midwifery Program there. Today she's going to discuss her forthcoming work and work in progress, Una Mujer Embarazada Necesita el Sol, Pregnant Migrant Women's Encounter with Immigration Enforcement at the U.S.-Mexico Border. Her research interests sit at the intersection of migration and reproductive justice, including the impact of detention on families and the experiences of pregnant migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border. She is the author of the article, Pregnancy in United States Immigration Detention, the Gendered Necropolitics of Reproductive Oppression, published in the International Feminist Journal of Politics. She's worked as a nurse midwife, caring for patients in Arizona, is a peer reviewer for the Journal of Midwifery and Women's Health, and teaches both reproductive health theory and clinical courses in reproductive health, as well as a midwifery practicum at Seattle University. After Amanda speaks, we'll have the opportunity to hear a response from Denise Gilman, who teaches and co-directs the immigration clinic here at Texas Law. Professor Gilman has written and practiced extensively in the international human rights and immigrants' rights fields. She is a founding board member of the Texas Immigration Law Council and recently published in the Loyola University of Chicago Law Journal, Making Protection Unexceptional, a reconceptualization of the U.S. asylum system. Thanks, Denise, for sharing your thoughts today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Amanda Heffernan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I was just saying that other than a very brief visit to El Paso 2 weeks ago, this is the first time I've ever been to Texas, so it's a beautiful campus. So this is my dissertation research that I'm talking about today, and I wanted to share some acknowledgments to my committee, and one of my committee members, Michelle Tellez, is my co-author on this article. She's not here today, but I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge that we're working on this together. And of course, the people who've accompanied me on the journey of accompanying people who are seeking asylum and the participants of the study, without whom we wouldn't be here. So where did this project come from? So I was living in Tucson. I was working as a nurse midwife in a community health center and a hospital there, practicing midwifery in the borderlands. The day before I did the first interview for this project, I had someone in clinic who had missed her prenatal care for 6 weeks because she was in a car that got pulled over, her partner got detained, the car got impounded, she couldn't get to her prenatal care for a period of time. So that was a really profound experience for me, the timing of that, just seeing the impacts of immigration enforcement at the border and inland. When I lived in Tucson, I was engaging in migrant justice activism. We went through the summer of 2018 with the family separations. And I learned from some of those folks that I acknowledged on the first slide, sort of how to walk with people seeking asylum with an accompaniment relationship. And then, especially in 2020, I started seeing the Border Patrol in the hospital at work. I mean, literally coming onto the labor and delivery unit and seeing Border Patrol officers outside of our patients' rooms because they'd been brought in from the desert to Tucson area hospitals. So I was already a PhD student while I was having all these experiences, and when it came time to figure out what I wanted to do for my dissertation, I thought I want to look at what's happening here for pregnant people at the border. So this study is kind of what happens when a midwife looks at what's happening at the border. This is the Eloy Detention Center that's sort of halfway between Phoenix and Tucson. And this is where the participant Letty, who we'll talk about in more depth in a few minutes, was detained during her pregnancy. So I'm going to actually leave most of these concepts for later, but this is the article that Blake mentioned in the introduction, and this was the lit review for the dissertation that I turned into an article. And these are some of the things that I was looking at as I was figuring out how to think about what's happening for pregnant people at the border. I was thinking about necropolitics, so the sort of outgrowth of Foucault's biopolitics, but it's not just about, what is the phrase, making live and letting die, but actually causing people to die on purpose as an exercise of state power. And then the whole literature on crimmigration, which those of you that are law students are probably more familiar with than I am, but looking at the increasing criminalization of migration since the 1980s, and then the way the rhetoric around that can be explicitly gendered and can be explicitly stigmatizing of pregnant migrants. And then looking at a reproductive justice framework for understanding incarceration as a form of reproductive oppression. And I was drawing here on Lisa Marie Cacho's work on social death, incarceration as social death. So what was it? I kind of hesitate to fully say it's a critical feminist ethnography. When you say ethnography, that draws in, the whole field of anthropology and the idea that you would be doing participant observation and field work. That was the goal, was to do that, to actually go to some physical places and sit and talk to people. I had some contacts at migrant shelters and immigration law clinics, but then the pandemic hit, and I conducted this research mostly early pandemic. And so these was all Zoom interviews. So definitely inspired by critical feminist ethnography methodological principles, but it was interview only. And I was originally focused on ICE detention, and the research questions are very focused on the word detention, and that's partly because of the time frame of when I began looking at this, and because I had known the participant Letty before I interviewed her for this study, and that's what was happening for people more in 2016, 2017, 2018, was being detained in ICE detention. But the period of the study encompasses this rapid series of policy changes, including MPP and Title 42. And so I started having a broader idea of what I meant by detention, including short-term CBP custody, which isn't always as short-term as it's supposed to be. As we probably all know, it's supposed to be 72 hours or less, but is not always. And then thinking about being stuck in northern Mexico, being retained in northern Mexico under MPP, or being expelled into northern Mexico under Title 42 or Title 8 as a form of detention. And it was actually one of my participants, who is a lawyer, who gave me this concept and said, you should go look up this idea of constructive custody. So the idea is if you're trapped in northern Mexico and the state is not letting you go anywhere else, you are detained, even if you're not in a detention facility. So who did I talk to? So again, my goal originally was to talk to formerly detained women. It was incredibly difficult to recruit folks from that population for reasons I think will be pretty obvious, like such a multiply marginalized population. And then I was also trying to recruit during the pandemic. So I ended up speaking to two people. Luckily, for the purposes of the study, they had been detained in 2018 and 2020, like really different time periods that were representative of the time periods I was trying to talk about. So I've treated them sort of as exemplars or sort of case study, and then filled in with a lot of information from the other 16 participants in this study who were either healthcare workers who'd cared for people in Border Patrol custody or ICE custody or Office of Refugee Resettlement for minors, people who volunteered as detention visitors, who were shelter workers, who were immigration attorneys, and in one case, a CASA foster care volunteer whose her person that she was supporting had been in ORR custody. And some of the participants have more than one of those identities. And I recruited through snowball sampling through networks of contacts. And one of the comments that I got from those of you who read my paper, which I really appreciated, was to talk a little bit more about methodology. So for the purposes of word count, it was a pretty brief method section in the paper, but I thought I'd spend a little time on it here because this was complicated and tricky to think through the ethics of how to conduct a study like this with such a marginalized population. Realizing that people would have concerns about possible disclosure of any of their information to authorities, and also talking about such heavy and traumatic parts of their lives, like could we be accidentally re-traumatizing people? And so we put a bunch of safeguards in place. So I got a waiver of signed consent, so nobody ever had to sign a document with their real name. I'm using pseudonyms. I'm committing to erase the recordings after they were transcribed. I read up on trauma-informed interviewing, and part of what that looked like was at the beginning of each interview, like really emphasizing you can decline to answer any question, we can skip a question and come back to it later. Just don't feel like you have to answer any question if it's too much. I had a bilingual therapist on standby to take referrals if anybody wanted to talk to a therapist after the interview. Nobody did, but that was there. Member checking, meaning allowing people the opportunity to see what I'd written if they wanted, which was limited by the fact that I wrote the dissertation in English and could only really offer that to my English-speaking participants. So that was imperfect, but an attempt at member checking. And then committing to doing something about this and not just talking about it. I was influenced, I think part of the way that I conducted the interviews was influenced by the fact that I'm a midwife and I talk to people about tender and delicate subjects all the time. But I was also influenced by work from Latina feminist methodologists who talked about testimonio and plática. So testimonio as like this sense that in your interview you're bearing witness to your own experience, the person who's interviewing you is bearing witness to your experience, and that it could be a consciousness-raising and empowering experience to do the interview, potentially, ideally. And plática is this sense of like a warm chat, not like I'm going to ask you all these questions and boom, 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 but just like a warm and human kind of connection. So one of the things that we did, and we just made this up, but I speak Spanish, but I didn't feel comfortable enough with my Spanish to just fully do the interviews by myself. So I had an interpreter, but I really didn't want to interrupt people talking about such intense experiences with like line by line interpretation. So what we decided to do was ask the question and then just let people talk. And then I could go back and ask questions about anything that I didn't understand or go back and clarify with the transcripts later. And this was, I have a note here too, that in the main article that I looked up about plática, there was the talking about the verb deshogarse, like to unburden yourself is what we really wanted people to have the opportunity to do. And so in the first interview with Letty, after the first couple questions kind of getting warmed up, she spoke for 27 minutes straight. I looked at it later on the interview transcript. So this choice was immediately rewarded, as I think it was a good one. She had a lot to say. And she did say that she felt better at the end of the interview. She said she felt proud of herself reflecting on her experiences at the end of the interview. The interview with Carolina she was tearful during the interview, and it wasn't as transformative of an experience, but I still feel like we made space for her in that way. So this is an example of my attempt at the public scholarship or doing something about it. Was an op-ed that I wrote in 2021. And then I'm going to leave this to the side, but happy to talk about it in Q&A. Some of the unanticipated findings that weren't in response to the original research questions were, once we started talking about pregnancy and migration, I realized that either becoming pregnant or the risk of pregnancy was really key to people's entire experience. For some, it was why they left. For some, they were attacked and then found out on the journey that they had become pregnant because of the attack, or the vulnerability to pregnancy influenced their decisions making their way, through Mexico and across the border. This sort of embodied experience of either being pregnant or knowing that you could get pregnant was part of everything. And then the healthcare workers that I interviewed expressed a lot of moral distress about their experiences caring for patients in Border Patrol custody. I hope to write a whole separate article about that. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to do it chronologically and look at experiences from 2017 through 2022, sort of the end of the Obama administration. And Obama had this policy called presumption of release, under which pregnant people were supposed to, by and large, be released and not detained, especially by ICE. Trump officially rescinded that in December of 2018. It became public in March of 2019 that policy was rescinded. So then there was this period of time of increased ICE detention. But then everything changed with MPP, where we were seeing much more retention in Mexico rather than detention. And then, of course, Title 42 in the era of rapid expulsions. And then Title 42 continued under Biden, but there was this announcement in July of 2021 that the administration was, again, by and large, no longer going to detain pregnant, postpartum, or lactating people. So we'll talk more about what that meant on the ground later. So under Obama, what participants said they mostly saw was humanitarian parole with family separation. So under presumption of release, pregnant women would get paroled, but their partner would usually be detained or deported. So this is Emily saying that it was family separation was a tactic of violence to dissuade people from seeking asylum. We're going to let you out on parole with the kids without any way of working, without a permit, without any support, and we're going to send your partner to detention to fight the same asylum case that you're going to fight, but from inside. And so we see this continuing throughout the Trump administration too, although later on it's going to be more expulsion than detention for the partners. So then Trump comes into office and makes the stigmatization of migrant motherhood really explicit, really public. So these are some of his tweets from that time, talking about anchor babies and birth tourism, and even talking about rescinding birthright citizenship. And so in this time frame, let me back up for a second. I'm kind of thinking about that concept of the cruelty as the point. So Democratic administrations might institute a policy like Biden's 2021 announcement or Obama's presumption of release, whereas Republican administrations are, putting this rhetoric more front and center, especially under Trump. So we have two stories in the study, that of Letty and that of Angela, that come from this time of increased ICE detention. So Letty was apprehended in the desert in early 2018 with her partner. They were immediately separated and he was deported. She spent a short period of time in Border Patrol custody and then was sent to ICE detention, where she spent about 2 months in the first and second trimester of her pregnancy. And then Angela's story was told to me secondhand by her sponsor. And she crossed in the Tijuana area and also spent several months of her first and second trimester in detention in California. I'm going to kind of skip over the terrible conditions in Hieleras because they're really well documented and we have a limited period of time. But there's lots of information out there about how terrible the conditions are in those short-term Border Patrol holding facilities. But what they said about ICE detention, so I think literally the first thing every single participant said when I asked them about ICE detention was something about how terrible the food is. So every participant that had any type of contact with ICE talked about. There's this quote from a lawyer saying that a guard told him, "I took it home and my dog wouldn't eat it." There's all these quotes. The one participant said, "When I think about it, I want to throw up." So poor quality food has a particular, it's terrible for everyone, but if you're pregnant, you're nauseous, you're vomiting, you're worried about your ability to maintain your nutrition, it has an increased impact. The inadequate and fragmented prenatal care. So people would often have a visit. They'd get one doctor's appointment. Maybe there's some documentation that someone listened to the baby's heart tones, but there's nothing like a complete systematic prenatal care the way that standard prenatal care is supposed to be, with a series of visits at intervals with certain lab draws and ultrasounds. Very fragmented, and sometimes not in the case of Letty and Angela, but in the case of stories that I heard from other participants, fragmented by transfers between facilities. So it's really difficult to have any kind of continuity of care. Medical neglect. So again, not Letty and Angela themselves, but things that they witnessed or that other participants talked about, were people who were bleeding or cramping. It took a long time to get someone's attention. Being in legal limbo, and then the use of solitary confinement. So this is the quote where the name of the article comes from. So this is Letty talking about how they only had 1 hour a day outside, and how terrible that was to be inside all day, looking out through a tiny window, only going outside for half an hour or an hour. And she says, a pregnant woman needs the sun, needs to receive the energy of the sun and not only be in the darkness. And then here she is talking about how she had terrible nausea and vomiting. She was so hungry, but she couldn't keep down any of the food that they offered in the cafeteria, and how worried she was about becoming anemic or having a health impact on the baby. In the second quote, she's talking about how she didn't have anyone to pay her bond, and so they presented her with this $1,500 bond, like, wow, this is so amazing, your bond is so low, and it is much lower than the average bond at the time, but if you don't have anyone to pay it, it doesn't matter how much it is. She had no family members in the United States, and neither did Angela. So Letty's was eventually paid by a church group, and Angela's was paid by the sponsor she was connected to through a LGBTQ organization. And then this last quote is about Letty witnessing another pregnant woman being deported at 7 months of pregnancy. So this is Angela. So Melissa was the actual research participant who had been a sponsor, but also a healthcare worker who had cared for people who had been detained. So it was one of those multiple identities. So she said that the fetus was measuring very small. When they had a maternal fetal medicine consultation, they said it was likely as a result of such poor nutrition and detention. And then the other quote is an instance that Angela witnessed of somebody, it taking a very long time for the guards to respond when she was having bleeding and cramping. Angela had a lot of stories about things that happened to other women in detention because there was a chickenpox outbreak in the detention center, and she was quarantined with all the other pregnant women. So chickenpox also is very dangerous in pregnancy, and she got to know everyone else who was pregnant quite well. So Joshua was an immigration lawyer in the Southeast. He didn't want the specific state identified, and said he had had 2 clients who had miscarried in their first trimester in detention. I at one point was able to see a very moving handwritten document that one of them had written about her experience, but was not able to get permission to use it in any way. But one of those 2 had been a nurse herself, so she knew very well that the prenatal care she was getting was not up to snuff. And then this quote is I think it was early 2018, right around the time of presumption of release being rescinded, being public. But he said to a guard, wait, don't you all release pregnant detainees barring extraordinary circumstances? And the guard said, we don't release them in their first trimester. And so what he went on to say was that the implication that he understood was we're going to kind of wait to see if they miscarry first. And then if they don't, then maybe we'll keep them, deport them. We might be more likely to release people if they are their second and their third trimester. And then Yesenia was an interesting case. She's a legal services provider, but had also been detained herself, not while pregnant, so it's sort of in different categories of participant. But this is her experience from when she was in detention and saw pregnant women coming through detention and ICE detention in New Jersey. And her impression was that they were deliberately kept isolated and unaware of their legal rights and kept away from other detainees who might try to explain their legal rights to them. She also talked about the delayed care in pregnancy. She said you had to write a slip and then in a few days after you wrote a slip, you'd get taken to medical to see the nurse, and then if you needed to see a doctor, it would take days or weeks after that. And she, in her interview, explicitly linked that to abortion access, that if you were trying to access an abortion out of detention, just the delay could end up putting you outside of the window of when you could receive an abortion, if that was even made available to you, which it generally isn't in detention. So moving on to 2019 to 2021, so MPP kind of rolled out across the border beginning in early 2019, affecting different sectors at different times throughout the year. But what we saw with Remain in Mexico was that people were no longer allowed to cross, were told to await their appointments in Mexico. Many people started living in encampments that had really squalid conditions. There's a lot of risk of kidnapping and extortion for ransom, sexual assault, and really difficult to access local prenatal birth and postpartum services, as well as abortion and contraception. So one of the lawyers that I had interviewed talked about how, people could be retained in Mexico for years, for months to years. Entire pregnancies could happen in that time frame, especially given a lack of access to contraception. And then what participants also talked about was that the longer people were retained in Mexico, the more pressure would build to try to cross, make an unauthorized crossing to try to get across before you had your baby. So kind of like the risks of prevention through deterrence in general, it made it more likely that people would try dangerous desert or river crossings the longer they were forced to wait. And then with Title 42, we saw that the rapid and often repeat or multiple expulsions included pregnant women. Some participants said that they cared for people who had been expelled multiple times, and it seemed like maybe once people were in their third trimester, or if they were having any type of pregnant, symptoms, cramping or bleeding, then they'd be allowed to stay. But it might have been the fourth or fifth time that they'd tried to cross. And then this is when participants started talking about what would happen when Border Patrol would bring people to the hospital for evaluation, and then what would happen to them afterwards. So the sort of three options of what could happen upon discharge from the hospital could be release, again, often with family separation built in, expulsion, or detention. So this is when we have Carolina's story. So Carolina fled violence and threats of extortion in southern Mexico in 2020 with her partner, and was crossing through the Sonoran Desert with a smuggler and wasn't keeping up. And so the smuggler abandoned them in the desert. So they decided to call 911. She started to have some bleeding and cramping. And then, as the quote says here, at first, when the ambulance came, someone told them, you could stay together. He could come with you to the hospital. And then that turned out not to be the case. They were separated. The partner was detained and then expelled. It took 7 months for them to be reunited. And she went to the hospital by herself and was diagnosed with a condition called placenta previa. So it's a very dangerous condition in pregnancy where the placenta completely crosses the cervical opening. If you give birth vaginally through a placenta previa, it causes a catastrophic hemorrhage. She didn't know she had it because she hadn't had prenatal care. And then at one point, she sort of was in the hospital for a little while. The bleeding stabilized, and one doctor was saying he was going to discharge her. So that's what this quote about at the bottom is. It says the doctor said, she had asked the doctor, but I'm still having some bleeding. I'm still having some cramping. What's going to happen to me if you discharge me and I get sent back to Mexico? And he said, well, they'll take you to, a medical unit that's near there, but you've got to go. You've got to go back to your country, was what he had said to her. Luckily, another physician came on. There was a change of shift, and she stayed and had her baby, and then eventually did receive humanitarian parole. So Victoria is one of the immigration lawyers that I talked to who worked in the Southwest and had these two clients. So the first client had waited in Mexico under MPP for several months, arrived for the court date and found out that it was canceled. At that court date, begged to be allowed into the U.S. for medical evaluation, and they said yes. But then she was evaluated, discharged from the hospital, and expelled under Title 42. And then, sorry, I lost the train of my story for a second. Right, so then because she didn't have a court date for several months after that, she decided to cross the river and went into labor and was taken to the hospital right around the time of that crossing. And so she had an emergency C-section and a lot of bleeding, and what Victoria is saying is, had she not been subjected to MPP and Title 42, so this is someone who was subjected to both MPP and Title 42, she would have had a much different experience in childbirth. And then while she was in labor, her husband was returned to Mexico. So again, we see the family separation. And then there's another case of someone that she cared for who was returned to Mexico to the site of her kidnapping. So that's something that Victoria just really emphasized throughout her whole interview, was that people are being returned to sites where they have been harmed. Quite literally, like the exact site where they had been harmed in the past. She had her discharge papers confiscated. That was a common theme throughout all of the interviews and all of the time periods, is having belongings and paperwork confiscated. She'd been told that she had an infection. They were working on preparing paperwork for her to be processed at the port as an exception. The Victoria had had a doctor review the medical records. But then she gave birth in Mexico to a very small and unstable neonate. And because she had been connected with this lawyer in the hospital, they were able to cross and be rushed to the NICU. But that's sort of a fluke, like a chance that she had happened to be connected with Victoria. And these are some voices from shelter workers in Tucson who were saying that some of the women who had been paroled, they're separating women from their husbands or their partners. They're separated for weeks. They don't know where their partner or their husband is. They'd stay with us for several weeks longer because they didn't want to leave Arizona until they knew what their partner was doing. So these are shelters where people often stay like maybe a night or 2 days. You know, they just want their plane ticket or their bus ticket to wherever they're heading in the rest of the United States. But these women didn't know where their partners were or what had happened to them. And then this story from Rebecca about a woman, and she said that she had witnessed this happen multiple times, where when the Border Patrol takes someone out of the hilera to go to the hospital, if they have young children, they'll just leave the children in the care of the other women in the hilera. So she went to the hospital, had a C-section, and then got put back in the hilera, but her 1.5-year-old was with strangers for 3 days during that time. So hearing more from the nurses and the midwives who were participants in the study who cared for people in the hospital during the MPP and Title 42 eras. So the first two quotes are kind of the same, talking about what they would see. So they would see, we know that when people have preterm contractions, that dehydration is a risk factor for preterm contractions. So there'd be a lot of preterm labor secondary to dehydration and stress. One of the midwives who worked in Texas said that she had seen people who actually fallen, like injuries, like falling from the wall. Rhabdo is rhabdomyolysis, which is consequences of extreme overheating and dehydration, lots of preterm labor. Claudia, who worked in the Rio Grande Valley, had cared for several women in the shelter where she volunteered who actually had given birth out in the field. And then Megan, who was a midwife in Texas, talked about Border Patrol asking for clearance to discharge people and send them back to detention or expel them. So this, she said, actually this, it's a completely different case in a different state, but this was also about placenta previa, the same complication that Carolina had. Our physician team did get involved and said absolutely not, explaining what the risks were of transferring someone that had a placental abnormality. So a subset of these healthcare providers decided to start getting involved to try to do something to improve the outcomes for their patients. So I'm going to talk about this for this one slide and then kind of leave it aside and hopefully talk about it in another article. But this is Leah, who is a nurse in southern Arizona, saying, when Title 42 hit, I realized, oh, okay, they're bringing pregnant people detained, and if there's nothing done, they're going to be immediately deported pretty much as soon as they're discharged from the hospital. So she had one patient where that happened. That was her first experience, just recognizing that her patient was going to get expelled upon hospital discharge. And then the second experience she had, she made the choice to connect her patient with a lawyer, possibly in violation of hospital policy, so taking a risk herself because she felt like she couldn't not do something for this patient. So the patient was discharged and expelled and had a preterm birth in Mexico. So preterm labor is what she'd been evaluated for. So there's the quote at the bottom says, calls into question how stable she actually was for discharge. But after the birth in Mexico, because she'd been connected with a lawyer, the lawyer arranged her crossing back into the U.S. And then this patient 3 is one of, I think, the saddest stories in the whole study. Is a similar thing. After discharge, she was expelled, but had been connected with a lawyer. The lawyer tried to call her, and someone else answered the phone and said he'd bought the phone from a woman who was covered in bruises. And that was the end of that, and we don't know what happened. So these nurses and midwives who were caring for patients in Border Patrol custody, mostly in 2020 and 2021, experienced a lot of moral distress about understanding what the options would be for their patients after hospital discharge. The participant that I call Fabiana was sort of an interesting, I don't know what almost like a counterfactual or counterpoint. This is someone who ran a shelter for pregnant women in Juarez, and it's the only shelter that I'm aware of on the border that is specifically only for pregnant women. And so a lot of the things that I asked her, that I said, I've heard this from other participants, that people can't access prenatal care. And she said, oh, yes, they can. But as we got deeper into the discussion, it turns out it's because this particular shelter offered an extremely high level of accompaniment to these folks. So they went into the hospital with them. They negotiated with hospital staff. They signed paperwork saying they would be financially responsible for these patients. They had people that they knew to call if the patient wasn't being allowed into the hospital to advocate. And so most people who are retained in Mexico or expelled into Mexico would not have that level of accompaniment or advocacy. And she also talked about what they would see among people, women who were expelled back into Juarez over the bridges in Juarez at that time. She said people with gestational diabetes that needed monitoring, people in hospital gowns, people with bloody underwear, no shoes, someone who was having contractions and needed an immediate C-section. So, I mean, she'd seen a lot of expulsions of people who really were not well or not like medically stable. So then in 2021, Title 42 is still in effect. But in July of 2021, Biden publicly committed to ending most detention of pregnant, postpartum, and lactating people. So it was an announcement. It was publicized. And this is what I said in the op-ed at the time, detention wasn't really what was happening to people at the time. What was happening to people was Title 42 expulsions and Title 8 removals, of which there were almost 100,000 a month each in the couple of months after this announcement was made, with no data about how many of those people were pregnant, postpartum, or lactating. There is data now about how many pregnant women are detained by ICE. So since 2020, these semi-annual reports have been available. And so we do have some data, and it does show that a lot fewer pregnant women are detained by ICE now than used to be under either Obama or Trump. So about, depending on the month, 20 to 65 pregnant women per month detained by ICE in the time period where the reports are available. Whereas in 2017 under Obama, it would have been about 100 per month. After Trump rescinded presumption of release, but before MPP, it would have been like 175 a month. So it is less, but lots of Title VIII removals continue. So again, detention isn't really what's happening for most people at the border. And so most of what people talked about in the interviews was related to before that announcement, but I did have a few perspectives from people after the announcement. And Megan was sort of puzzled. I thought there were supposed to be fewer detained people coming through, but it seems like the number is still high. Fabiana said conditions haven't improved. The only thing that's a little bit better is that there's more communication between CBP and local organizations. So this is kind of the consortium period where humanitarian organizations on the border had lists of people that they could get across, like capped per week. That's not happening so much anymore. And then this is Leah asking the Border Patrol agent who was guarding her patient in the hospital. I asked what he thought was going to happen with the patient, and he said he didn't know. He never knew until the word came down. He was often surprised by whatever the judgment call was that was made, but they were releasing more people to the community who are pregnant than they had been before. So that's kind of what people, yes, maybe more people are getting released, but I'm still seeing a lot of people detained. And this quote from Leah kind of encapsulates what I saw throughout the whole study period, and every single interview was how arbitrary everything was. So the individual officer, the supervisor that was on call that day, the sector, the time period, individual patient characteristics. Were they in their third trimester? Were they obviously pregnant? Were they having symptoms? It's like virtually impossible to predict what the outcome would be for any individual patient because they're so arbitrary and dependent on so many factors. Okay, so kind of getting into the discussion. I think we started a little late, but I'm recognizing that I'm a little late too. But so my basic conclusion is that there is harm to pregnant people under all of these policy regimes. It doesn't look exactly the same under all of these policy regimes, but returning to gendered necropolitics. So prevention through deterrence, we know, is designed to direct people to cross in more dangerous parts of the border where they're more likely to die. So lots of people have written about how that's necropolitical. But pregnant bodies experience that impact, especially of the heat, dehydration in the desert, more than non-pregnant bodies. So this article, this Campbell-Stanton article was about, it was a very physiologic article looking at the thermohydric stress and how quickly someone gets dehydrated or overheated. And they looked at male, female, non-pregnant, and pregnant people's bodies, and pregnant people were more impacted by the heat and the dryness in the desert more quickly. And then once people are detained, INDA in 2020 talked about the necropolitics of uncare, that medical neglect as a form of necropolitics in detention. And then again, under Trump, we have this concept of the cruelty is the point, that one of the Latin American feminist writers that I looked at was Rita Segato, who's an Argentinian feminist who talks about impunity as expressive violence. And she was talking about feminicidio in Juarez, but I think the family separations of 2018 function similarly. Like, look at me, look at what I can do, nobody can make it stop. And so many people were trying to make the family separations in 2018 stop, and nobody could. So it's like an expression of power. And then DeGeneva and Roy talk about the border as discipline, as an obstacle course, an endurance test. Border crossing becomes an apprenticeship for a lifelong subordination. But then what's happening under Democratic administrations that are publicizing their humanitarian exceptions? So I have two authors that I found helpful in thinking through this. One was Williams on humanitarian exceptions, who says, exceptional humanitarian policies that show sympathy towards a small number of undocumented migrants temper and reinforce more widespread exclusionary immigration policies. I could think about this like Obama with DACA, but also being deporter in chief. So it's like the humanitarian exceptions almost serve to prop up the whole structure. And then Andaya was writing about women in New York City who had Medicare only when they were pregnant and lost it afterwards. And she talked about temporary zones of inclusion and unequal health citizens moving in and out of a right to health insurance depending on pregnancy, and previously insured women of state concern only as producers of citizen fetuses. So I think you can think of the 2021 announcement from Biden as a perinatal temporary zone of inclusion as well. Wonder if I should skip through this a little quickly as we're at 55 after the hour. But one thing that I will say here is that Rita Segato, in her work on patriarchy and violence and feminicidio, talks about el cárcel de su cuerpo, that patriarchal violence works to trap women in their bodies. And she talks explicitly about forced pregnancy and coerced pregnancy. And it really struck me that Fabiana said almost exactly the same thing. One of her direct quotes is, "You're stuck within your own body," when she was talking about people trapped in northern Mexico. And I think, Fabiana as a participant and Segato as a feminist writer are helping us kind of put the body at the center of the analysis. So when we're thinking about necropolitics on the border, we're thinking about a politics of death. We want to counter that with a politics of life, right? Or an ethic of life. But we have to be really careful not to engage in rhetoric or thinking that runs the risk of advancing fetal personhood and undermining abortion access. So I got this actually because of watching the videos of people that spoke here last year and then looking at their articles. So Vargas said that, and especially in a post-Dobbs context, we have to be really careful about how we frame our advocacy. And so I think the reproductive justice framework from Black feminist academics and activists in the United States is a really powerful way to work through that. The most often quoted definition of reproductive justice, the sister song definition, the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. I feel like that one sentence contains volumes. It says so much. It holds both individual autonomy and collective and familial well-being without canceling each other out, and it's a human rights framework. And so when we combine that with the voices of Latin American feminists, again, we have Felix de Souza from South America talking about putting the female body at the center of the analysis. And then this, Vero Rosas talked about claiming the undocumented mother as a form of resistance. So pushing back against the stigmatization, against good immigrant, bad immigrant rhetoric with like a full-throated claiming of undocumented mother. But again, like Vargas says, she says it should not be an uncritical eulogy of the feminine that may reduce the mother to non-existence or to give selflessly as a result of biological fate. So it's not about her as the carrier of the fetus, it's about her as a full human being having an embodied experience and with the right to autonomy. This is something that I heard someone say in a webinar last week, and I was so struck by it, I wrote it down and I put it on the slides. Because the state controls us, it has a responsibility to guarantee reproductive justice. Anything less is state-sponsored violence. So when the state puts you in detention, when it forces you to stay in northern Mexico under MPP or because of Title 42, when you're granted humanitarian parole but separated from your partner and put into a situation where you have to try to get care in our totally fragmented healthcare system, the state is controlling what we can and can't access, so it has a responsibility. And I think detention standards show, even though they are violated all the time, they're an expression of that responsibility, that when you're detained, whoever's detaining you has to take care of you. And so finally, a couple of policy recommendations. So if we're going to be informed by reproductive justice, that means we're looking at the whole family, right? So it's not just, well, I gave this pregnant person humanitarian parole, but the family separation matters. Thinking about accountability beyond the rhetoric. So that means holding Biden accountable. If he's saying he's not detaining people anymore, but what's happening is expulsion, not detention, then we need to push back on that and say, well, are you expelling pregnant folks? And again, responding to the reality of the situation on the ground, not just something that sounds good. And then because I'm a midwife, I'm probably more focused on the healthcare aspect of what was happening in hospitals. And so I think we need to demand more of healthcare institutions. One way to organize around that is via sanctuary hospital initiatives. Although, as I was talking about with some of you at lunch, sanctuary hospital initiatives are largely about barring law enforcement from coming into the hospital to look for people or detain people. It's a little bit more complicated when someone comes into the hospital already in custody, and the sanctuary hospital initiatives wouldn't necessarily prevent that, so that's complicated. So what about medical legal partnerships? Why did these nurses have to do something that felt clandestine, that felt putting their jobs at risk to connect these patients with lawyers? What if when you come into the hospital in custody, there's a medical legal partnership where you get access to a lawyer, and that's how it is. It's above ground. And then, collective resistance from healthcare workers, not just one person putting their job on the line for one patient. But an example of that was in 2019, physicians at Banner U of A Hospital in Tucson wrote a a letter that could be put in a patient's medical record that says, yes, I'm discharging this patient, but I am not clearing this person to return to detention. I'm not giving my agreement that returning them to a detention setting is acceptable. And that was done collectively. There were multiple physicians who used that letter and put it in the chart. Wasn't just one person putting themselves out on a limb. Well, that's what I've got.
So thank you so much for that. Fascinating. And a lot of it resonates with my experiences. I'm going to start with something that isn't really directly connected to any of this at all, but hearing from the kind of nurse midwife perspective reminds me that my younger son's very first protest was outside of a hospital that just 2 weeks after he was born got rid of the midwife practice that had allowed me to have him with a midwife. And so it really is, I hope that there's something really beneficial in hearing your perspective from the pregnancy care side of things, and then hopefully marrying that a little bit with what resonates for me from the lawyer's perspective, having worked on many of these cases and worked on legal advocacy around some of these issues too. I hope that it can be enriching, but I certainly found the paper incredibly interesting. And one of the very top line parts of the paper that I thought was really important to bring forth is the extent to which there's an underlying racism and gender stereotyping and discrimination that both motivates some of the immigration policies you're talking about, but that are certainly informed by, and I really would argue motivated by, assumptions and beliefs that are xenophobic about women in general, and specifically women who are migrants, who are othered in our system. And then that the fact of the gender and migration status can be used to justify policies that are quite harsh. So it's motivating, and then it's also the justification that's used when people ask, well, how can it be that detention is widespread? Well, it's to address the flows of migration that we have that are out of control and are in crisis. And I think it's no accident the language that you highlight that is specifically used in the gender context around, birth, what do they call them? Birth tourism, anchor babies, chain migration, and the rest that has to do with the idea that not only are you getting a migrant, you may be getting even more migrants because it is a woman and because they're othered. And that, I think, it's pretty easy to make the jump to some of the discourse that we're seeing right now around replacement theory and the rest. So it's no accident of this particular kind of stereotyping that justifies some of the policies and then is used to explain harsh policies once they're in place. So I thought that was really important to bring to the forefront. The paper is also really interesting because it brings together immigration enforcement worlds with other disciplines, specifically parenting and childbirth, but also sort of healthcare and then your sociological, anthropological perspective as well. I do think, and that's fascinating, I do think those two worlds aren't always talking, or those multiple worlds aren't always talking. It is tricky because then you're in the position of needing to do both sociological, anthropological analysis and legal analysis, and we know that immigration law is as complex as it gets. And so I would invite you, as you kind of continue to work on this paper, to really sit down with some lawyers. I'm happy to try to help, because there are things that, for those of us who are immersed on the legal side, can be distracting if it doesn't feel like it's exactly quite right, and then you lose the point of it, which is, I think, a really important point, because something that we lose as lawyers is sometimes the actual human experience of what these policies and laws are, and I think that's what you bring into the mix. So again, I think that the convergence of the two could be really important, but it is a failing of lawyers that we have a hard time seeing past anything that seems like it might be not exactly right in terms of the law. And in that vein, I wanted to point out just a couple of things. I won't go into the nitty-gritty legal issues, but a couple of things that I do think might go to your larger themes, that are questions I had about the way you're thinking about the law piece of it. So the biggest one is actually this idea that women were being forced to make a decision between staying in Mexico, in northern Mexico, or going ahead and making the dangerous journey north. It seems to me that's no choice at all, and that seems important to your theme. And the reason I say it's no choice at all is partly because neither one is a good choice. They are both very much a part of intentional U.S. immigration policy. But really specifically, the fact that you go ahead and decide to make the crossing does not mean that you won't end up back in northern Mexico, as you point out in some of your examples. So it's not an either or, that you're either in Mexico waiting or you make the journey, and if you make it across, you're going to be fine as long as you don't die. You might still end up back in northern Mexico, and vice versa. Some people might not wait in northern Mexico until the pressure builds up and then decide to cross, because they know that the way the policies are being enforced mean that waiting just may not ever be enough. And so by suggesting that people wait until the pressure builds up and then cross, you suggest a little bit that the ones who are doing the right thing are the ones who wait until they just can't stand it any longer. And or it could be understood that way, when actually I think any logical person might be able to see the situation and say, from the beginning, we're going to try to cross, and that might or might not work. You might still end up in northern Mexico. So that's just one example of where kind of the practicalities of the legal system do play into the way your choices are being described for women. And then the other related one is relating to the idea that the fact that right now there are lower numbers of pregnant persons in detention doesn't say much, because so many people might be just getting removed summarily. I think it's probably both. In other words, I think probably pregnant persons are getting held in detention, at least in CBP and maybe in ICE, for at least some period before being returned. Now, in your study period, it is possible that they were getting returned so quickly that they never made it to ICE, because Title 42 doesn't end until May of 23. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's important because the Title 8 expulsions that you mentioned, those almost always are going to entail at least some period of detention. It may be shorter, so the numbers might not look as high, because the numbers look higher if people are longer in any particular snapshot moment. You're going to see more people if people are being held longer. But I think it's worth noting that probably at least some pregnant individuals are both detained and then expelled pretty quickly still, if that makes sense. So that's kind of my where the immigration law piece might fit into some of this. Taking it back out to big picture a little bit more, I do want to delve into the use of the necropolitics framing. And this may just be because, again, as a lawyer, it's a little bit less of a familiar go-to framing. But also, it's just because it seems that the reproductive justice framing does so much important work here that I'm not completely sure what it brings. But if it does, I'd want to understand a little bit more about it, to the extent so that it helps somebody like me to really understand how this better helps me to understand overall the situation and why I should be worried about it and what we should do about it. To the extent that what you're really trying to get at is this whole question of the cruelty is the point, I agree that the cruelty is the point, and I think it would be worth tying that more explicitly to your explanation of necropolitics, if that's what it is. Some folks, might think that it's not always the case that the cruelty is the point. For example, at least in the situation of, as you mentioned, the Obama and Biden administrations, where there seem to be these carve-outs for certain pregnant persons within overall harsh policies. But I think you're right to point out the extent to which that really doesn't take away from the overall approach, because there can be no doubt that almost all of the detention, expulsion, diversion of people to different parts of the border policies that you describe in your paper are quite explicitly intended to deter migration, including to deter asylum seekers. And I'd encourage you to, in fact, pull in some of the language that's out there by Obama, by Biden, by Trump, that makes that very, very explicit. And so if the entire border enforcement policy apparatus is intended to be cruel enough to deter people from coming, the carve-out in minimal instances of a particular group that doesn't even ending up being much of a carve-out, it really can't take away from the overall fact that the cruelty is the point, and that women are going to be, pregnant persons and women both are going to be particularly harshly impacted by those policies, and it's not going to do anything just to sort of try to create a minimal carve-out if the overall goal is to harm, knowing that harmful policies are going to have these particular impacts on women and pregnant persons. I think that was the main thing I wanted to mention about the framing of the overall piece, and just to mention in concluding that it would be helpful to understand the framework, because then it would, and what you find to be most useful, because it would help us to think about which additional pieces fit clearly within that framework. So, for example, your study was focused more on ICE detention rather than CBP. It's currently the case that at least women and children are quite regularly being held in CBP custody for lengthy periods of time. So, how does that fit within the framework that you're trying to set out? Having greater clarity about it would help us to understand that a little bit more. Similarly, the whole point about hospitals and the way healthcare workers respond, I think, would be better understood, better thought about if we saw, kind of what is the overall framework, and where do hospitals and hospital workers fit into that? Are they part of a necropolitics regime, or are they separate from it, resisting it? Where do they fit into the piece? But overall, it's clear that the language of crisis and chain migration and the rest is such a huge part of what we're seeing now at the border, that your effort to describe kind of the real impacts that has on people's lives is critical to us both thinking about what's happening and thinking about what we should be doing differently. So I'm incredibly grateful for your work.